All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's June Nature and You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I am the Education Associate at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a small conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in the region. The region that we focus on is the northern Intercoast Range and the neighboring areas of the Central Valley. So if you don't know, the northern Intercoast Range are the mountains that are on the western side of the Central Valley. So if you're looking west from Sacramento or Davis, that's what you're looking at. We particularly focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we led the effort to get established in 2016, and which we recently helped to lead the effort to expand. In addition to that public lands advocacy work, we also do a variety of other things, including education programming, including field trips for K-12 classes, writing natural history articles for our newsletter and local newspapers, and of course, this monthly Nature and You lecture series. We also do a variety of outdoor adventures programming for the public, including hikes, trail building days, wildflower tours, and our youth boot bank, which provides free loans of hiking boots to kids. So if you've got some kiddos that need some hiking boots, we're going to be doing our monthly boot bank office hours next Wednesday. If you want to learn more about any of these projects or any of the other work that we do, you can do that at our website, tuleyome.org. All right, so on to tonight's lecture. This lecture is supported by folks like you. So if you haven't already had the chance to do so, we greatly appreciate a small donation of $5 or more to help support the lecture series. And I'll put the link in the chat for that. All right. And so tonight we are very lucky to have Dr. Hekia Bodwitch with us. So Dr. Bodwitch joined Tuleyome at the start of this year as our policy director, and we're really excited to have her on the Tuleyome team. She earned her bachelor's degree from Cornell and then her PhD from UC Berkeley in environmental science policy and management. And tonight, she will be discussing how Indigenous knowledge can inform environmental planning. So if you have any questions during the talk, let's hang on to those until the end, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, so Dr. Bodwitch, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks everyone for being here. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Hekia Bodwitch, and I recently joined Tuleyome as the policy director. As the policy director, I'm working on advocating for initiatives that support stewardship of the North Intercoastal Range, Tuleyome's region of interest. And I'm also, as part of that, will be trying to understand ways that we can also support tribal co-stewardship of these lands. And I want to start by acknowledging that I am a settler conservationist. My family has European settler roots. And as such, in discussions around Indigenous knowledge, I'm one voice among many. And other voices also deserve to be heard, including the voices of the Bay Miwok peoples and Ohlone peoples whose land I currently reside on. I'm physically based right now in Lafayette, California. I grew up in upstate New York. My mom is from New Zealand. She gave me a Maori name, but we are not Indigenous. Growing up, I spent time with my namesake, who's a prominent Maori leader, and I saw the incredible amount of pressure Maori leaders and Indigenous leaders in general are under to manage a limited number of resources to support current and future generations and supporting both human and non-human relatives in the process. And I grew interested in better understanding the sorts of steps that we as a conservation community and a policy advocacy community can take to support Indigenous groups' abilities to inform management decisions. As many of you are probably aware, over the last 5-10 years, we've seen an unprecedented interest from Western governments in engaging Indigenous knowledge. So in the US, this interest has included a memo from President Biden administration to the heads of federal departments and agencies in 2021 to directing agencies to recognize Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, ITEK, a form of Indigenous knowledge, as one of the many important bodies of knowledge that contributes to our collective understanding of the natural world. The memo goes on to say that ITEK is a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, practices, and beliefs that promote responsible stewardship of natural resources. ITEK has evolved over millennia, continues to evolve, and includes extensive observations, lessons, and skills passed from generation to generation. This of course raises questions of how this is done, and various folks have sought to understand this question, and part of what I'm trying to do here this evening is build a discussion or build our capacity to support the use of Indigenous knowledge in environmental management. So I'll be talking about why we should engage Indigenous knowledge, what engaging Indigenous knowledge entails. In particular, I'll talk about the ideas of knowledge co-production and two-eyed seeing, and then how we can implement the principles of knowledge co-production and two-eyed seeing. And when I'm discussing this work, I'll be talking a little bit about my work prior to coming to Tuleyome that has taken place with Indigenous groups in both New Zealand and Canada. I'll be talking about a knowledge co-production case study that I've been involved in Nunutziavut, which is in the Canadian Arctic, north of Newfoundland and Labrador. So the US government is interested in Indigenous knowledge. Why? Well, from the White House, we see several rationales. Two key rationales given are one, that engaging Indigenous knowledge can improve decision-making. From the chair of the Council of Environmental Quality in 2021, alongside the release of the memo, we see the argument that tribal and Native communities have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. Their voices and their expertise are critical to finding solutions to address the climate crisis, an issue that disproportionately affects tribal and Native communities. We also see the argument made that engaging Indigenous knowledge can support justice outcomes. So we see from a group of Indigenous leaders who have been advisors to the Biden administration's initiatives, that recognizing the importance of Indigenous knowledge is part of a necessary process of recognizing history and rectifying relationships. I want to pause it here, that to understand how engaging Indigenous knowledge can improve decision-making and rectify relationships, we need to also understand the limits of alternative paradigms. Jeff mentioned that I've been trained in two Western institutions, Cornell and UC Berkeley, and my training has been as an environmental scientist, a Western scientist. Characteristics of Western science that have been identified in studies of the history of science and the sociology of science, and that also resonate with my training and possibly some of your training, is when we're talking about Western, we're generally describing Western European modes of thinking and governing, the legacies of those modes. Western scientists generally share knowledge through written, peer-reviewed publications. When sharing results, Western scientists are encouraged to explain how they followed the scientific method. And the scientific method is generally considered a process in which a scientist will ask a question, do some background research, construct a hypothesis based on their background research and maybe their own observations, test the hypothesis with an experiment, draw conclusions from that experiment, and then communicate the results. A key element or key characteristic of Western science is the idea that science is replicable. So if I follow the same method you did, I will get the same results and I will interpret the results similarly. And as an effect of this kind of idea that science is replicable, when publishing results in written peer-reviewed publications, part of what scientists are evaluated on is whether or not whether or not they've communicated the information clearly enough that someone else could follow that information or follow that procedure. Robert Merton is often considered maybe like a father of the field of the sociology of science, and has written a foundational text that various folks have engaged with in different ways, critiquing and advancing some of his thinking that may be worth pursuing for those who want to better understand characteristics of Western science. Western science, and particularly this idea that science is replicable, has a particular relationship to the Enlightenment period, where during the late 17th and 18th centuries, attempts were made to distinguish Western science from religion. And these attempts were made in part based on an effort or driven by an effort to challenge the church's authority. So at that time, the church's authority was established in part by the idea that certain individuals, priests in the church, have a privileged access and privileged ability to access truth. The idea that science is replicable, if I follow the same method you did, I can get the same results, suggests that actually truth can be something that does not require engaging with the church to ascertain. This history has been outlined by various scholars, including a great book by Chapin and Schaefer called Leviathan and the Air Pump. Western science's challenge to the church's authority was largely successful, and a legacy of that challenge has been seen in the interest of Western government agencies and the mandates that are imposed on Western government agencies in the US and elsewhere to consider the best scientific information available when making decisions. This is true of the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, two entities that manage land in Berryessa's Snow Mountain National Monument, a region that we, of course, at Tuleyome care deeply about. However, Western science, of course, is only one way of knowing the world. Indigenous peoples have also developed systems for understanding and living in places where Western institutions operate. Indigenous peoples include groups whose territories others seek to permanently live in and govern. I'm getting that conception in part from work from Kyle Powes-White, an Indigenous scholar. Settler societies operate within Indigenous peoples' territories. Again, I was trained recently at UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley is on Ohlone tribal land. So historically, Western scientists rarely collaborated with Indigenous groups when making claims about the processes that affect Indigenous peoples. Instead, in certain instances, some Western scientists have been accused of for operating as parachute scientists, coming into a place, taking some data and leaving with little follow through, little reporting back to the community about the implications of their study, and those who have been accused of operating as parachute scientists are often or rarely also conducting work that Indigenous groups results in the advancement of Indigenous groups' interests. Historically, settler governments rarely consulted with Indigenous people when making decisions. And both scientists and policymakers' failures to account for Indigenous people's knowledge has, at times, adversely affected Indigenous groups' abilities to access benefits from resources. And this last claim, that scientists and policymakers' failures to account for Indigenous people's knowledge has, at times, perpetuated environmental injustices, has been highlighted, in my experience, very vividly working with eel fishers in New Zealand. In New Zealand, eel is a species of cultural importance to Maori groups who relied on eel diandrous species for dietary fat after they were pushed off upstream land to make way for European farmers. And in New Zealand, the government has advanced major efforts to expand the nation's dairy industry. And in doing so, they've also supported the implementation of large-scale irrigation schemes. Maori fishers that I've worked with were very well aware that the implementation of one of the nation's largest irrigation schemes down the South Island of New Zealand around Christchurch area were aware that the scheme would affect eel populations. However, the environmental impact assessments that evaluated the schemes did not include Maori fishers' knowledge. The knowledge was not in formats that were amenable to bureaucratic decision-making processes. Fishers had, communicated their information orally, often on the boat, over dinner. They were not sharing information via PowerPoint slides or written documents. The New Zealand government approved the scheme. In this case, it was implemented and the eel fishery ended up collapsing. I've written about this case in a paper a couple of years ago and several articles since that I'm happy to share and discuss more with anyone who is interested. So what does engaging Indigenous knowledge entail? Federal agencies in the US and scientists and others have increasingly promoted the concept of knowledge co-production. And this concept has been described as a process that brings together Indigenous people's knowledge systems and science to generate new knowledge and understandings of the world that would likely not be achieved through the application of only one knowledge system. Two-eyed seeing is a valuable concept that applies knowledge co-production principles. And I'm quoting here from an Indigenous group who's written about knowledge co-production up in the Arctic. Two-eyed seeing, or Ebduapdimunk, which means I see from both sides, is a Mi'kmaq concept of knowledge co-production, or sorry, knowledge coexistence. Mi'kmaq territory encompasses Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, the island of Newfoundland, parts of New Brunswick, parts of Quebec, and parts of the state of Maine. So we're talking about the eastern Atlantic part of Canada. Mi'kmaq scholars Merdina and Albert Marshall developed the concept of two-eyed seeing when they were mentoring Mi'kmaq students, and they've defined this concept or described this concept as an idea of learning to see from one eye with the strength of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. So I'm going to take a minute here, 3 minutes actually, to share a a clip from Albert Marshall talking about two-eyed seeing. This is part of a longer clip or a longer video of him describing the concept, which I encourage anyone who's interested to watch. Albert Marshall's been thinking about this concept for a long time and trying to explain what it means to people. And he has there's a lot of richness in what he has to say. And I've got about 3 minutes of it here for us to listen to.
Well, whatever challenges may be. So two-eye seeing is not meant to look at everything as to how can you question the integrity of an action or the integrity of a word. But I, as an individual, with my curiosity working overdrive, I have this inherent responsibility to look at this concept or these actions and try to transform it by fine-tuning it to be that much more reflective for me, for myself, so I could be much more effective as I employ these two perspectives or multiple perspectives, so that my efforts will be much more beneficial for the common good. Because, again, it's ingrained in your culture that every action, every aspect of your life is ingrained in your culture, that it's not only politically or legally expedient that I will lend my services more for the benefit of others and very little for me, because I can recognize and see my vulnerability, or whatever you want to call it. I'm a human being. I can be susceptible or subjected to be incapacitated at any given time. But if I maintain the spirit of collectiveness, collective consciousness, then I'm relieving myself from an undue pressure if and when I become somehow incapacitated. I don't have to concern myself who's going to look after my well-being, who's going to look after my family, because I know the community will do that automatically. So my only task at this point is to use all that energy that I didn't have to expend of worrying about it, who's going to look after me and my family. I can focus all that energy I have now and to ward off that invasion that whatever my body is going through at this point, and focus all that energy so I can become then ASAP, become a contributing member of a community, of a nation. So
that's a form of great wealth, isn't it?
yes.
The knowledge that you don't have to worry about. Well,
So I'll leave us there, but I again encourage you to watch the full clip. If you search YouTube, it's Albert Marshall Learning to See with Both Eyes from 2023. And there's several key elements of two-eyed seeing that I think are really important to highlight for our efforts to engage Indigenous knowledge in environmental management that Albert Marshall has written about since and is variously kind of brought up in various government documents that try to engage Indigenous knowledge, but I think it's really important to us to think about these implications explicitly. So the first kind of series of thought that Marshall describes, both that we see in this little clip, but also throughout the rest of the clip, is that Indigenous knowledge is part of a system. It's a whole system of thinking, which means that relationships with Indigenous communities are really needed to engage Indigenous knowledge. Or along these same lines, Indigenous knowledge is not a data point to integrate with Western science, right? It's part of this whole system of thinking and collective kind of stewardship and responsibility. So from an advocacy perspective or from a policy perspective, if we want to be engaging Indigenous knowledge, we also have to make sure that Indigenous groups have the authority to really steward the land and make decisions based on that knowledge. A second line of thinking is tied to the idea that Indigenous knowledge holders have obligations to act on the knowledge they gain. Again, it's not a data point that you can integrate with Western science, but instead, this knowledge also comes with a particular implication for how we make policy, which when we think about it in relation to Western science isn't that different, right? We're making Western science data and observations. We have this whole system of funding scientists whose data is then supposed to inform decision-making from governments. So we see that also with Indigenous knowledge, right? This knowledge is also part of a system to inform decision-making. And in order to meet obligations to act on knowledge gained, the obligations that Indigenous knowledge holders have, Indigenous knowledge holders really need support from their communities. I think that's something we see in this clip pretty clearly, right? You need to know that your other needs are going to be met. And as a result, possibilities for engaging Indigenous knowledge from a policymaking perspective really rest in part on the well-being of Indigenous communities. And this is something I don't see really explicitly brought up in recent government documents for engaging Indigenous knowledge, but this idea that we really also have to be supporting Indigenous community well-being. You know, folks can't be worried about putting food on their table, who's going to babysit their kids, if they're also going to be asked to go make observations about environmental dynamics. So, you know, folks need to have their other needs met to make these observations, and then in order to act on the obligations that they have to steward the land and actually, you know, create change through these observations, Indigenous groups also need to have some sort of authority to make decisions. So I mentioned earlier that Albert and Merdina Marshall developed this concept, and they talk about this in the clip at a different point, in their work with Mi'kmaq students. And their initial motivation for developing the concept of two-eyed seeing was to encourage students, Mi'kmaq students who are learning about the impacts of Western colonialism to not also, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, that there might be helpful elements of Western thinking that we should be considering when we're trying to promote stewardship. And our responsibility is to identify the most helpful elements of both Western and Indigenous systems and ways of knowing. Since that work with students, Albert Marshall has collaborated with Indigenous scholars and Western scientists to describe how this concept of two-eyed seeing can be applied to research. And others have attempted to apply two-eyed seeing concepts to research in various contexts, including I just recently saw a report talking about two-eyed seeing for forest management in the Western US and in some of the areas that we're interested in. In the context of research, Albert Marshall has argued with Andrea Reed, an Indigenous scholar, and others that when applied to research, two-eyed seeing is a cyclical process that can only be fully realized through the conceptualization of a given research program as a relationship to be maintained and honored over the long term. So Reed and Marshall describe a process in which this might happen where mutual research interests are identified, research is co-developed, outcomes of the research are co-evaluated, and co-benefits from the the research result. Multiple groups are recognized as participants, and this results in long-term relationships that can help facilitate the development of additional research projects. Two-eyed seeing parallels other Indigenous concepts of knowledge coexistence, including the idea of two-row wampum from Haudenosaunee in the Northeast, two ways from Aboriginal Australia, the idea of a double canoe from Maori. But I want to note that even though two-eyed seeing parallels other Indigenous concepts of knowledge coexistence, other groups may use different language or have different concepts for describing their knowledge in relation to Western science. And understanding others' concepts is important for relationship building. This has been particularly the case in the work that I'll be talking about in a moment here, up in the Canadian Arctic, where Nunatsiavut, north of Newfoundland and Labrador, north of Mi'kmaq territory. Folks don't use the term two-eyed seeing, but the principles certainly apply to efforts to steward and understand their lands. So Nunatsiavut is an Inuit-governed territory, and historically, Nunatsiavut community members have been recipients of parachute science. Scientists have come in, and in the Arctic especially, been highly reliant on community members for organizing their visit, making sure scientists have access to resources and transportation to get around the area relies on conversations with community members. And when scientists leave with little follow through, it's very obvious. The Sustainable Nunatsiavut Futures Project is a large-scale transdisciplinary project that I've been involved in, started in 2020. And the project includes conservation organizations, it includes Western scientists, and it includes Inuit government officials and community members. And the project was initially designed to fund the co-production of knowledge about climate change with scientists and Nunatsiavut community members. And I'll discuss in a minute the extent to which we've been successful in doing that. So factors that have facilitated knowledge co-production include the Inuit-led Nunatsiavut government holding a position as co-principal investigator on the project. So, a co-lead for decision-making around how project funding is allocated and to whom and where. The Nunatsiavut government also holds territorial jurisdiction to the area. So these are two characteristics of what's going on in Nunatsiavut that we don't often see for Indigenous tribe or Indigenous scientist partnerships. The idea that that an Indigenous government can actually be in part in charge of funding allocations, or that the government actually holds territorial jurisdiction and can govern what's going on in their area. So these are unique things to Nunatsiavut, and in a way suggest, if we can't do it here, or this is a really exemplary case. So, it's, I think, important to think through for implications for elsewhere. The Nunatsiavut government also is able to direct research conducted in the area. So when scientists want to do research in Nunatsiavut as of the past several years, they're required to get ethics approval process from the Nunatsiavut government's ethics review board or research advisory council. And the process, as folks on the council will describe, is not designed to stop research, but rather to make sure scientists are aligning their work with previous work that's been done in the region, something that wasn't always happening historically with the parachute science, and also describing the policy implications of their results when they're presenting their material. Folks who are doing research in the area are also encouraged to ensure that the projects that they're doing support community members' needs. The Nunatsiavut government also owns the data that's collected for any research that's done in the region. So there's quite a bit of discussion around data sovereignty and how to protect Indigenous knowledge. There's also questions around, when research is done in Indigenous territories, who owns the data, and there's pretty progressive attempts happening right now in Nunutziavut to ensure tribal sovereignty is advanced in those discussions. Another factor that facilitated knowledge co-production for the project is that the Nunutziavut project has hired Inuit community members to coordinate with other community members and within the communities they're based for discussions around scientists. So having folks on the ground, quite a few of the Inuit community members who we've hired are younger. They have great insights on social media and describing science to others, and they've been a key part of building relationships. The Nunutziavut government has also funded and led Indigenous knowledge research to identify scientific research needs. So the government has worked with communities. They've gone out to their communities. They do this every couple of years to talk to folks about what their concerns are about resource use, so what sort of science needs to be done. So key challenges in the area are questions around the status of Arctic char populations. Arctic char is a very important species for subsistence in the area. Food is expensive, and changes to char populations, of course, are visible as climatic changes intensify. And so better understanding and collaborating with scientists as to what those changes might look like or what they imply for future food resource access is really important. And that's what part of folks who've been involved in the project have sought to understand. However, questions remain as to whether or not we're actually co-producing knowledge. So we've encountered several challenges within this project. The first challenge relates to mismatchers between funders' timelines and timelines for relationship building. Funders are often funding students for maybe a PhD or a master's project. PhD maybe 3 years, master's less. Rarely are funders also funding students to, after they've written up all their results, go back and report results back to community. As a result, scientific data collected and shared is often not in formats amenable to policy-making processes. Scientists aren't funded to do this. Natural scientists who might be sampling tissue from char might not also have developed the skill set to identify the policy implications of their research. That might be a whole different PhD project. Another challenge that we've encountered has to do with the impacts of colonialism on Indigenous knowledge systems. So community members have limited access to resources to make observations about climate change. So in the case of fisheries, boats and fuel, for example. And limited access to those resources means that the folks who do have the ability to go out and fish often experience research fatigue. And another access constraint for fisheries has to do with the legal right to go out and fish and sell your fish, so to support your income from fishing. The folks that are commercial fishers, the couple individuals within the community who have commercial fishing rights, are repeatedly asked to provide insights on the status of the resource, and they experience research fatigue. They don't want to engage with researchers anymore. A third challenge we found has to do with translating knowledge into policy, in that not only are there challenges, or is there a gap between the science that's identified and what the Nunutziavut government can do with that science, but there's also a gap between the Nunutziavut government's recommendations for what should be done and what actually happens at the federal level. So in the context of certain resources, including commercial fishing, non-Indigenous policymakers retain the authority to make decisions. And at times they've ignored Nunatsiavut governing bodies' recommendations. And we've written about some of this in several articles and have an article in review right now. So why are we talking about all these challenges? Well, by diagnosing the problem, we can start to think about potential solutions. We could also think about potential problems that we might encounter in our efforts to engage Indigenous knowledge in the California context, and solutions for overcoming those challenges. So kind of anticipating what we might want to think about preparing for when we're working to engage Indigenous knowledge in decision making. So challenges related to mismatches between funders' timelines and relationship building timelines. Solution, encourage funders to support relationship building. Data is shared in formats that are not amenable to policymaking processes. We can try to organize and analyze existing data, right? We can staff Indigenous groups, right? We can help organize the data that exists. Resources are needed to support Indigenous knowledge holders and mitigate research fatigue. That being a challenge, and a potential solution is that we can work to increase Indigenous groups' access to resources that support Indigenous knowledge systems, which might mean access rights, capital, or time. This is something that Tuleyome is working on, protecting Moloch-Luyok and Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument while ensuring that tribes have the ability to engage practices they would like to do in that region. And I think is an important part of restoring access and ensuring that groups have the ability to go out and make observations about climate change or other environmental dynamics. Another challenge relates to settler state officials' rejection at times of Indigenous knowledge holders' requests, and this idea that the settler state retains the authority to make these decisions. Potential solution, I think this is something, again, Tuleyome is great, has a great history of doing, is building alliances, right? So trying to build alliances with non-Indigenous citizens to promote particular forms of policy change that otherwise, without those alliances, government decision makers might be reluctant to advance for political reasons. Working to promote public education about Indigenous rights and histories is also important, and that's something we're certainly thinking about and working on at Tuleyome and in some of our trail building or restoration initiatives, is also thinking about ways to communicate why it's important to use the trails that are designated and maybe not go to other regions. So to recap, why should we engage Indigenous knowledge in environmental management? Well, improve decision-making and repair relationships, advance justice. What does engaging Indigenous knowledge entail? And understanding that Indigenous knowledge is part of a system. Relationships with Indigenous knowledge holders. And support for Indigenous communities. So how do we do this? We build relationships with Indigenous groups and we work to support their needs. I have a list here of some of the references that I've referred to in this talk, and I'm happy to share any of this with folks who are interested and answer any questions.